A question came up in our Acts series as you preached, Mark, on the whole idea of the indigenous church, which I think is such an interesting topic for missions. Because it's so easy for us to take what we have in America and just kind of plop that down in another culture and expect it to survive, and it doesn't often work quite the way that we hope it will. And you mentioned some obstacles to forming indigenous churches in other cultures. And I wonder if you could kind of review some of those ideas.
Sure. One of the obstacles, as I see it, is taking too much of our tradition with us and assuming that we're able to reproduce a similar experience that we've had back home. We fail to understand perhaps sometimes that our practice of Christianity, wherever we start, is itself contextual to our experience. In this case, Americans coming from a school like Bob Jones University, how we practice, how we think about Christianity is both biblical, but it is also contextualized by our own experience. So if we're not careful, we take all of that with us to the field and we think we've got to recreate all of that, not just that which is innately biblical and eternal, but along with that, all of the application, all of our own particular practice. Whereas if we would go to the field and as best we can, this is not much easier said than done, but as best we can, look at what is essentially the message of the New Testament, communicate that in a way that is understandable in that culture, and then help the people to put that into practice in their own culture without us saying, okay, it has to look like this, it has to be done like this. And of course, years ago, the epitome of the over-context, or the, I should say, the under-contextualization was, the idea of somebody carrying an organ into the jungle of Africa and so on. We don't really do those overt things as much, but we tend to bring with us all of the baggage, which in our own culture is great and it's helpful and it really helps make us who we are. But we assume that every other culture will benefit if we can just reproduce that. And the reality is, culture is a very complex thing, and until we really understand that culture and we see how we can express Christianity in that culture in a way that makes genuine Christ followers out of people of that indigenous location, we're really not establishing indigenous local churches.
That makes me think about a really obvious kind of question, because sometimes we hear people say that, well, I don't really need missions training. I'll just go and just preach the Bible and all those things that are of course very important. But what do you think about the importance of missions training? And we could probably go for
yeah, obviously that's
hours on this question.
That's been the course of my life, so that's a topic in which I'm very passionate. But I would say this: ideally, a missionary is someone who is both very strong in his ability to exegete Scripture. So if someone goes to the field and they're a cultural expert, but they don't know the Bible, well, what are you going to communicate? So you need seminary training and solid biblical foundation. But then you also need the ability to take the same amount of focus and rigor and intentionality to understanding the culture. So that when you speak, what you're thinking is actually what ends up in the mind of your hearer. And that again is very difficult to actually do. And it takes study and practice and learning how to build those relationships and how to build a level of trust and how to understand the cultural dynamics and then communicate what is essentially biblical to that person, so that now, from within their framework, as much as is not anti-Christian or anti-biblical, from within their cultural framework, they begin to live out that gospel truth in ways that are normal for their people. And then because it's not foreign. It doesn't come across as a foreign religion. It's native Christianity. It is indigenous Christianity. It is more attractive and more relational with their own people, and therefore has a much greater likelihood of spreading and having permanent effect in that culture.
Well, that sounds pretty complex to carry all that out and to fulfill the gospel. We're thankful that you've joined us today, and hopefully this has been a helpful session for you.